So this debate goes on. Obviously, Ottawa has yet to make a decision. The pressure is intense, right? Because we have the U.S., our biggest ally, and this incredibly porous border, especially when it comes to telecom stuff, saying,
absolutely,
we will treat you very differently if you go with Huawei. Meanwhile, there's this kind of growing concern about research, IP. What's your messaging around this? Because Canadians we're fearful, and the stuff with Meng Wanzhou, the Canadians detained in China, none of it helps, right? Alykhan, we all kind of look at this and go, this doesn't feel like a friendly kind of situation.
It's a very complicated situation. And what we say is that Huawei has been in Canada since 2008. We have 1,200 employees here in Canada. It's growing, and we've served all three major telecom carriers, Rogers, Bell, and Telus, and obviously we have an R&D presence. And so all we sort of ask is that we keep the politics to one side, and you judge us on the technology, and you judge us on our economic contribution to Canada.
And if Canada's position was, we feel like you are quite literally the Chinese government, that there's no distinction between this company and the Chinese government. And the Chinese government has shown itself willing to overstep what we consider kind of rule of law, friendly behavior, good diplomacy. We do have 2 Canadians detained for a year. How do we respond to that? What's the kind of corporate response to that when we say you are the Chinese government and we don't necessarily trust you?
I mean, I think decisions should be based on facts, right? Not based on rhetoric. And, here in Huawei in Canada, everyone in Huawei here has to follow Canadian laws and Canadian laws alone, from the top of our organization, our president Eric, to me, to our CTO Rob, to the engineer beavering away in a lab. Mm-hmm. We only have to follow Canadian laws. We've been here since 2008, and in the last 11 years, we haven't had a single incident here in Canada, not a single complaint from any of our telecom carrier customers or any of the government agencies that regulate us. And so our sort of hope is that decisions related to Huawei are made based on technology and our history here in Canada, not based on kind of the political rhetoric you see on the front pages.
Would you agree, though, that we've had from, not from you, I've never had this conversation with you before, but we've had from Huawei execs over time this denial that they are the Chinese government, that they're arm's length, which I think actually does a disservice here, because there's a reality inside China, right, that there really isn't any separation between church and state there. It is all state.
Well, look, I can't pretend to be an expert on Chinese corporate governance laws. What I do know is that in China there are state-owned enterprises, and Huawei is clearly not that, right? It is an employee-owned company in China. It's a private company in China. Now, obviously, a private company in China is different than a private company in Canada, but it's clearly not a state-owned enterprise. In Canada, Huawei Canada is a private company that's incorporated under the laws of the Government of Canada. It has the requirements in terms of certain kind of a Canadian presence on its as its directors, and all of our officers and employees in Canada have to follow Canadian laws alone. And the last thing I would say is that all of our activities in Canada occur through the Canadian company.
Through the subsidiary. Right. Over time, a lot of Canadians own the phones. A lot of Canadians kind of know Huawei, have had a fairly benign view of it. And certainly this network included, we should say, a relationship with the equipment, right? Bell is one of the companies that has used Huawei equipment in parts of our network. I don't know what the plan is for 5G, but what would you say when you see this 2/3 of Canadians now have kind of a suspicious view? There is a kind of a negative effect of everything that's been going on, whether it's true or not, whether there is literal spying through the Huawei technology or not. I don't know. I don't know enough about it to know. What do you say to
There isn't. Let me assure you that.
Well, I don't know
okay.
that you can say that either with 100% certainty, right? But I think you would say you feel confident that there isn't.
Yes.
Some Canadians are less confident. We don't know for sure, right? This is the nature of this technology. There's this uncertainty factor.
Look, I think that I think there's a few sort of responses that I would have to that. So the first is that, look, there are the polls. The polls are never great. I mean, I'm not sure any Canadian business is very popular in the polls. We judge our support by what our customers say, right? People who buy our phones are happy by its battery life. They're happy about the quality of the camera. The telecom carriers who buy our network equipment, we haven't had a single complaint from them. We can't discuss, obviously, sales because they're commercially sensitive. Suffice it to say that we have a very healthy relationship with all of our carrier customers in Canada. And ultimately, the nature of the technology that we sell, right, the sort of the base station equipment, the radio access network equipment, the antennas, once we sell it to the Bells, the Teluses, the Rogers, or whoever, amongst the telecom carriers, it's their equipment, right? They own it. We have no access to it without their permission and without their direct supervision. And so they are ultimately in control of what happens to it. There's no sort of remote access that Huawei has, if you will. And fundamentally, they're the experts on these questions. They're experts on their own network. And they have, continued to work with us with no complaints. And I think that's probably the best judge of whether Canadians should be anxious.
Do you feel as though there are other issues motivating the U.S. on this file? In other words, it's difficult for the allies of the U.S., and we rely on them for security issues in a big picture way, right? Through 2 world wars, through, you name it, we kind of turn to the U.S. and say, we'll follow you, even though sometimes they've followed us into those wars, we should note. When they say we don't trust this company and we're not using the technology, do you feel as though there's a subtext there? Is that about something other than simple security issues?
I think so, and I think, look, from a Canadian perspective, we're obviously in a very difficult position, right? Because we're caught in the middle of a trade fight between our second biggest trading partner, the U.S., our biggest trading partner, the U.S., and our second biggest trading partner, China, right? And so, essentially, the Trump administration is forcing Canada to choose sides, and as a middle power, you should never have to choose between, your first biggest trading partner and your second biggest trading partner. And so, I think that there's certainly a lot of political rhetoric surrounding Huawei. I think a lot of the activities and the actions that have been taken against Huawei in the United States and on a global stage are motivated by President Trump and his pursuit of how he best wants to pursue his trade war against China. I think that kind of from a Canadian perspective, and certainly from the government of Canada's perspective, our hope is that, we try to stay out of these issues, we try to stay out of the politics and just make decisions that are in the best interest of Canada. And those are decisions that are made based on technology, not politics.
Unfortunately, there are politics. We have these 2 Canadians, innocent Canadians, being held so far without much due process. What will happen to Huawei Canada? Has there been any conversation if our government says no Huawei technology in next generation build out? Do you know what will happen to the subsidiary?
Yeah, so look, we're in regular contact, kind of the officials level, at the technical experts level with the government of Canada, and that's just because of the nature of the business that we're in. We're in a heavily regulated industry, and I think I would describe those contacts at the kind of the expert level as positive. In terms of Huawei's Canada's future, we're committed to Canada, right? So we're not going to speculate on what decision the government might or might not make on 5G, other than to say, we're happy to meet any test, any standard they have, and we hope they make the decision based on technology, not politics. But leaving that decision aside, our commitment to Canada remains. We have a number of lines of business in Canada, including an extremely rapidly growing R&D business. And regardless of what happens on 5G or on other issues, our commitment to Canada remains and will be secure.